Thank you for joining us today and welcome to our webinar, CMMC, The Road to Compliance. I'm your host, Liz Syka, Vice President of Marketing here at Sidara. Joining us today on our panel of experts, we have Derek Kristich, CEO and co-founder of Sidara. We have Dilip Singh, Vice President of Cyber Operations. And from Principia Raid, we have co-founder Jeff Roberts. A little overview of our two organizations. Sidara is a managed security services provider offering services to improve an organization's cybersecurity maturity, including assessment and penetration testing, security engineering, SOC services with managed detection and response, managed SIEM, endpoint protection, and threat detection. Similarly, Principia Raid is a cybersecurity group focused on response, assurance and compliance, information security and design. They deliver information technology, advisory, and consulting services with the specific focus on information security. Let's get started. Our first question, what is CMMC and why does it matter? Jeff, do you want to take this?
Yeah, sure, Liz. What do we have, about 4 hours this afternoon? Does that sound about right? That's how long it could take to answer this question. Apologies for the sarcasm. I won't apologize because it's entertaining. So, okay, let's try to give the short answer because this is a pretty deep subject. But at a high level, cybersecurity is a top priority for the Department of Defense. So they have come up with the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification to reinforce the importance of cybersecurity across the defense industrial base, right? Which is targeted by more and more frequent and complex cyber attacks. So the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification program is aligned to DoD's InfoSec requirements for companies in that space, designed to basically enforce the set of requirements that has been in contracts with companies across the DIB for quite some time. The NIST 800-171 as a compliance and regulatory framework will be more than familiar to companies in this space. And that's been a requirement in contracts for any company in the defense supply chain since 2018, in some cases since back in 2014. But the short version is that non-compliance with that particular set of regulatory framework requirements has resulted in the DoD coming up with an actual assessment approach. The way that we typically like to describe it to make it clear between the two things is NIST 800-171 are the rules. It's what you have to do. The technical requirements, the practices, the policies, the behaviors are all spelled out in NIST 800-171 as a rule set. The DoD has introduced CMMC as the assessment program to determine how well companies are performing against the required rule set. And, we could go all day, right? It's a tiered model with multiple tiers of different requirements depending on a company's position in the DIB. There's an assessment requirement stipulating that companies must demonstrate assessment against these standards. And this is a set of rules that's going to be implemented through contracts. I'll hand off the why does it matter question because it's that contract gate requirement that really turns that into here's why you need to pay attention. So I'll hand that one off.
Yeah, no, great, Jeff. And you're right. This could take more than 4 hours to kind of go through this. And it's it's how you boil it down and like, why does it matter? I mean, one, you're required to do it. If you're in the supply chain, you're absolutely required to do that. From a cybersecurity perspective, you are what your suppliers are, your supply chain up, your supply chain down. For some people, this is their customers. For other people, this is their supply chain to support their customers and their bill of materials and things. So, it's really important. It's good for business. It's something that, you are required to do, but it's something that we see a lot of businesses actually proclaiming that they're CMMC certified, those kinds of things as well. So the other reason is you probably already stated that you're doing this, in some point. So you self-assessed, you've done it before. This has got more meat to it, Jeff. This is something that 800-171 people used to do all the time. But it was a self-assessment only. The maturity of that going forward is still to be determined, but CMMC is not going anywhere. So you better figure out what it is. how to do it, what you actually said when you actually became a Department of Defense supply chain contractor, and what you're telling your customers, what you're responsible for as well. So lots of reasons why it matters.
Philip, I think there's a lot of confusion in general about
Yeah.
what does CMMC mean versus, again, right, NIST 800-171. And I think it's, let's spend 30 seconds there. And we continually reinforce the regulatory framework that's published by NIST is a set of good behaviors. It's best practices. It's all of the no-brainer cybersecurity stuff you should be doing anyway, just to protect your information, your assets, your IP. And it happens that this is a common set of regulations that, again, we spend so much time talking to our customers who are concerned about what is CMMC, this test we're going to have to pass, this certification we're going to have to get to keep our contracts and to get new ones. And we continually try to make very clear, look, that's something to consider. But potentially what's more important is what you're already contractually obligated to do that you are not doing.
Right.
That's a problem. That's why CMMC became this reinforcement of, okay, all these things that you're already not doing. Maybe you're close, maybe you're 80%. That's great. Maybe you've got a good self-assessed score, but CMMC is going to end up being a contract gate that becomes go or no go for these companies. So if you haven't been taking those requirements seriously, that's the whole concept behind the assessment. But keep clear, CMMC is not NIST 800-171. It's simply the government's method to enforce assessments to prove that you're actually doing what is in NIST 800-171.
Right. Absolutely.
Jeff, you touched on, kind of a key point that there's been some interesting milestones along the way in terms of defining CMMC and when it became applicable and what the next, kind of timelines are. But I think you touched on a really key point here in that a lot of organizations have been having to do the same sort of thing since 2014 and even earlier, back when it was called DFARS and just, part of the regular supply chain. But way back then, it was really only being applied to the primes, right? The primary contractors under the government, and they weren't really required to flow it all the way down. So I think one of the things that I find interesting is really how mature some of those primes are as they talk about this sort of thing, and how brand new this is to someone, 3 or 4 layers down, tier 2, tier 3 providers in that supply chain. So, I think something to keep in mind in a lot of conversations that we have is that it might be new to some organizations that are starting this process, but this is almost a decade old for some of these larger contractors that are that are really starting to flow these down.
Yeah, absolutely. And, valid impact assessment to companies in the small to medium space that potentially maybe they knew it was a thing, maybe it was in some contracts, but the pressure on compliance and on enforcing compliance down to those 3rd and 4th and 5th and 6th level of subcontractors was simply, there was never enforcement, there was never follow-up, and it was left to the primes to make sure that they were doing the appropriate supply chain flow down. But let's also be clear, that's where many of the vulnerabilities and data leaks and breaches occurred since 2018 in these smaller organizations without the requisite controls in place that has led the DoD to make this enforceable and frankly to start prosecuting companies under the False Claims Act who are misrepresenting their contractual compliance, which again is a whole other conversation, but that's started. Now that they're giving the assessment process some teeth, they're actually enforcing penalties on companies who have published incorrect assessment results.
Next question. Who does CMMC apply to? I'm going to pass this one to you, Jeff, again.
Sure. Again, great question. So the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, the simple answer is anyone who does business in the defense supply chain is who it applies to. I apologize for the acronyms, but any company who is in the procurement chain with the DoD, any primes to the DoD, or any DoD contractors anywhere in the chain is likely to see these requirements show up in their contracts if they haven't already. And the code to look for is your DFARS set of clauses in your existing or new contracts, which is the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation, which spells out what you must do in order to do business with the DoD and other branches of the federal government. So the rough estimate here is it's expected that somewhere around 300,000 businesses in the US who have not previously been impacted by compliance and regulatory frameworks like this are going to be impacted. The talk in the ecosystem is even that number may be underestimated, right? It's easy for us to talk about the primes, the Lockheeds, the Northrops, the Boeings, and all the main suppliers into the big guys. But when you look at a company like Raytheon, who pretty effectively manages their supply chain, that could be 37 levels deep. And the way that CMMC has been designed to accommodate this is by the multiple tiered approach, right? A CMMC level 1 requirement, you're going to have to do 17 things to strengthen your cybersecurity policies and practices. A CMMC level 2 requirement is typically where most companies in the space will likely fit. You're going to have to do 110 things and measure against them. And then a level 3 is a significantly larger number than that. You know, level 3s are munitions, defense, arms, they're direct contractors, typically in the DoD. So the majority of those 300,000-ish customers are expected to come in at level 2. But again, that's a swag, right? It's a guess. It's a very broad space. And there are many companies who are likely to be impacted that may not expect they're going to be impacted. If you do something as simple as manufacture plastic bags that somebody puts their PCBs in or their bolts in, and that's going on an airframe, you're going to be impacted with CMMC. It's challenging in that SMB space for sure.
Yeah, no, agreed. I'll take it from the, who does CMMC apply to within the company, and then maybe a little bit of like, do I need to be compliant? So you'd be surprised how many customers we have, future customers that don't even know they actually are part of the supply chain. You ask the first question, do you do business with the government? And they're like, no, we don't. And the next one is like, well, we do, but it's only this little thing. And it says, well, what's your contract status? Have you looked up your contracts? And they're like, what's that? And so he kind of wants that. So, I always tell people go to sam.gov, or there's a bunch of other contractor sites that Conan looked at, just to actually look at what's your contract. One second, ask your finance department. Actually, who's your contract, and like that. Surprisingly enough, most people, there's a lot of companies lower down. I'm pretty sure the Raytheons and their supply chains know who they are, but there's a lot of people who don't realize they're a part of it. And the first time they get this is when they get that prime assessment saying, hey, how is your security program? What are you lying to 801-71? When do you plan on being completed? So that's where it starts, and it's usually an IT person saying, do I need to do this? And we say, yes, if you're required to, but it's not just an IT problem. So within the business, who it applies to is people think it's just IT, it's just a security person or a CISO or somebody who has governance. It really is a business decision, and it's probably been made before. And I would say go look through your finance part, and if it applies to you there, then yes, it absolutely does apply. I think the only thing that's pretty clear that doesn't apply to is kind of over the shelf kind of things, COTS, kinds of things that are commercially available. You're not gonna be going through a supply chain. You don't need to go through that process with that. But if there's any questions, look through sam.gov, talk to your own internal teams. If you have an FSO or something like that already, and if you know that, then you obviously have that part of that decision. So start with that, and then move into what Jeff is talking about, which is absolutely where it's going and where you are in the maturity of the 3 different levels. So absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dilip.
Yeah.
We deal with companies all the time who don't actually understand their own level of requirement. Yeah. To your point, start with your contracts officer, right? That's a great place to ask the question. If somebody's going to know, it's typically contracts or finance. But the reason I go back there is we deal with another problem in that same space, where maybe it comes in through IT, or frankly, it comes in through sales or marketing.
Yes.
And you get someone who just goes, well, yeah, we're doing that. And it's signed and it's moved on. And all of a sudden, you've acknowledged compliance with something that the business actually hasn't had a chance to evaluate.
Right.
That's a problem, right? So we see kind of hidden requirements in contracts because companies are eager to get that DoD contract or contract to a sub, and they're agreeing to things without necessarily understanding the ramifications. And that's challenging to sort out, right? That's a disclosure potentially problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think, when answering this question, one of the couple things I always think about is, if you haven't looked at contracts on SAM.gov, or you haven't gone through your own contracts officer or finance, or maybe you do know that you do business, but you're still trying to figure out what levels you need to be at. I just think back to the purpose of this, right? There's a few purposes of this, in protecting the supply chain. One is, are you critical in delivering products or services up to the supply chain? Whereby if you can't deliver those anymore, is it a problem for the U.S. government or the Department of Defense, right? Can we not defend the country any longer or do that portion of it that you're part of if you can't operate, right? If you have a ransomware attack or something far worse, that you're not in business anymore, either internally or because of your supply chain, you can't get parts or products. What does that actually mean, right? If you just think about those things, it starts to become pretty logical about where you might fit into the space. And I think the second part of that is protecting U.S. government information. And I won't say secrets, right? Classified programs, secret programs, and the documents with those have been really strictly governed for a very, very long time. But you have this whole set of information, build plans and materials and information about unclassified programs that doesn't necessarily, it still needs to be restricted, right? It doesn't mean we want all that information out in the open. So it's also about protecting that information that you might be purview to in that supply chain. So I always think about those two types of things, like what type of information do you have that maybe is sensitive, and then what is your importance in the supply chain? I mean, those two things, even if you don't know anything else, will really help kind of point you in the right direction, because it just kind of logically makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great point, Derek. Actually, from a context perspective, who does it apply to? Are you impacted? If you don't know the answers to any of those things, but you know that as a company, you have controlled unclassified information, that's the answer. You will be impacted, right? It's sensitive data that you either store, transmit, or facilitate. If there's any data that falls under that controlled unclassified information category, you are likely to be impacted here. That's a great lens to look at it through if you don't already know the answer.
And maybe one additional point there is there's a lot of organizations that are I'll say playing catch up with the regulation and where it fits in, whereby you might be part of a supply chain that someone didn't know they had to flow the requirements down. So you might be required to, even though it's not in your contract. That will eventually catch up. They will eventually find those and fix those, and you will all of a sudden be subject to requirements at some point for maybe something you're already doing business for, and just didn't realize it yet.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Our next question. CMMC as a concept has been around for a while. What are some of the latest developments, and how has that impacted organization in terms of compliance and cybersecurity strategies? Jeff, want to start it?
Yeah, sure. I think the short answer to this one is because of the extended rulemaking process. I'll get into some of the details, keep it high level. Because CMMC has been coming for a while now and has been delayed, and it was initially going to be 2020 and then 2021, and now it's 2023. We've seen a lot of companies continuing to kick the ball down the road and going, we'll deal with this when we have to deal with it. When this is really going to be a thing, we'll deal with it. We'll deal with it when it starts showing up in our contracts. We'll deal with it later. Why should I make this investment now when I don't even know if it's going to happen? It's been delayed 3 times. We can answer those questions because those delays are, I'm going to knock on wood just to be safe. But so the timeline has now solidified where we know what is going to happen. We know when it is going to happen. And there may be some slight changes in the process and the details of assessments, but the short version is DoD has finally officially submitted the CMMC rule for regulatory review, and that begins the countdown towards official publication of the rule, right? Any executive branch rules get reviewed by the Office of Management and Budget as part of the process. And that matters because delays basically there's a whole bunch of reasons, but the time it took for DoD to submit the rule for review, now the submission's over. That's a significant gate in the process. So the rest of the rulemaking process is now in motion. There's government bureaucracy involved. But what we know is the rule should be reviewed and published, we think, late October, early November. We know when it was submitted for review. We know that the typical review period is 66 business days. You can do the math. So the expected publication window is late October of this year. Once that happens, there will be a 60-day public comment period. We think so end of December 2023, end of the public comment period. If I fast forward, we think, and by we, I certainly Principia Raid, but in general, the ecosystem seems to have some consensus on this one. It's not likely to see this published as a rule showing up in contracts until Q1 2025. It means that there's still some time, there's still some bureaucratic rulemaking process to go through. There are questions around, is it going to get published as an interim rule or a proposed rule, which could impact when it might go into effect. But the short version is Q1 2025. We expect companies to start seeing it in contracts, but that's not the end of the story. Because CMMC is tiered and there are different levels of target organizations, the expectation is there's going to be a 3-year phased rollout for CMMC contract clauses. So 2025 through 2028 is when, if you're a company and you know this is a requirement, that's your window. You might get it showing up in your contract in January of 2025, right? 14 short months from now. Or you might have another 2 or 3 years. That's all speculation. I think the point here, as far as the DoD is concerned, CMMC's rule, the rule is done, right? From their perspective, this is sorted. It's only about going through the details of publishing it, and this is happening. I think the message that we try to send back to certainly our customers and anybody else that we advise is these delays have been real. They've been driven by process improvements, but where we are now is the potentially short window that companies have to get ready is something that they should absolutely be leveraging, right? You can't wait until, oh, we got this in our contract. We'll take 18 months to close the important gaps that we have. No, that means you're not getting the contract. So as of today, the runway remains relatively short. You've got 14 months to deal with significant gaps and vulnerabilities that may put you subject to missing that contract gate. Again, keep in mind the phased rollout. So the higher up you are in the supply chain of importance, the earlier you are likely to see the requirement. That being said, companies that we work with that are starting from scratch, 18 to 24 months is an aggressive window to close some of these security gaps, because it's not just technical implementations, it's policy, it's procedures, it's standards, it's documentation. So, our message is, this is great. You've got some time, but if you don't have a plan rolling, you better get one started.
Yeah.
I think, from a technical perspective too, of anyone that's been kind of following this process over the last couple of years, I think a lot of people have seen, even back to DFARS, right? What framework am I using? Is it 853 or 80171, and then CSF 1.1, and then CSF 2.0, and then back to 1.1, and all of these sorts of discussions. So I think that's kind of been a real scenario for everyone trying to, I don't want to say a moving target as much. I'll say maybe that's the case, but I think the reality, going back to what I said before, is that this serves a couple purposes, right? It's about protecting your ability to do business, which is good for you regardless of if this is part of a DoD contract or not, right? If you're down, you're losing money anyway, commercial, defense or otherwise. And then the other part of it is protecting, protecting information, which again, yes, this is to protect government information, but at the same time, you don't want any of your information out in the wild too. So bottom line is all of these things are really our best practices. And I mean, we're seeing organizations that only have to be level 1 compliant, and they know that, but they're doing level 3 because the majority of the controls and the things you have to do are really just good practices for good security programs anyway. So a lot of organizations are really kind of using this as a catalyst rather than using it as handcuffs. And when you start to think about it that way, then you really start to think about, well, this really is just best practices for better monitoring and having a more secure environment.
Yeah, I'm starting to think that CMMC Saga was one of the Star Wars movies I missed because the trilogy or something like that. You know, things that I've just kind of gone through and twists and plots and turns and so like that. But you know, like Star Wars, it's really just, you know, good versus evil, and that's really the story. And how do you get better, and how do you keep balance within the Force? You know, so the moments of time like that, they all go to the strategy. The things you need to do are still the same. You know, so I think that's what I would focus on as much as you know, the saga has been very interesting. Jeff, I think you are right. I think we are at the end of the trilogy. There's not a George Lucas has sold his bill of goods here, and I think we're actually going to see the new movies here. So I'm very positive on that side. What I would say is the primes are going to do this to you anyhow. Unless you're a prime, doesn't matter when that actual the government tells you when it's going to be done. The primes are already telling you, and if it's a part of your business, then you should be doing this anyhow. So
yeah, I would agree with that. It's very much it's definitely been a saga for sure. You win for the nerd reference so far on this one.
Okay. good.
And I think, again, it's back to the moving targets. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that a lot of the debate has really just been around how important are some of these things to implement for smaller organizations, right? The level 1, 2, 3, where do you fit in? So how important are some of these things to implement, and how difficult or expensive or cost effective can some of these things really be to smaller organizations in the supply chain? So when you're going through this process, for some of the things that may be unclear, if it's overly burdensome from a cost perspective or a level of effort to implement, those are the types of things that are getting pulled back at a level. But again, there's really nothing in any of these frameworks or requirements that's not just good best practice. And again, remember the primes have been doing this for more than a decade, so there's really no surprises in here for them. They've really no major changes for them in terms of the way they've been thinking about this. There might be small technical changes on the way they approach certain things, but I think to Jeff's point, yes, from a process standpoint, we're at the end of that road. But a lot of these things are really just things that a majority of organizations should be doing to begin with.
I can tell you, Derek, we are seeing a shift in some of the perception about, oh, we're only doing this because we have to, oh, we're doing this because it's the right thing to do and it's a business differentiator, which is all true. But I don't know, I don't want to sidetrack the discussion, but I think it's a worthwhile point. The difficulty of obtaining and maintaining decent cyber insurance these days is becoming more and more challenging. We're starting to see many of our customers actually get faced with pretty complicated questionnaires when it comes to just re-upping on already existing cybersecurity insurance. We know that that's driven by the increased average cost of a data breach. And if you simply look at, so I'm getting back to the small to medium companies are concerned about what's this going to cost. The answer is more than they want it to cost. But the remediation against their vulnerability for a breach is outweighed by an order of magnitude against the investment in better cybersecurity. I mean, we're seeing average breach costs just in the last year now between 4.5 to about 6 million. And that's the same average breach cost. It's not quite the same, it's close. So average breach for an enterprise with 10,000 employees and up, it's about 4.5 to 6.2 million. Average breach cost for a company of less than 100 employees is 3.7 million. So just because you're a small company does not mitigate the cost of a breach in lost business, lost data, frankly, or bankruptcy. So the challenge there is your risk as a company is dramatically amplified by not doing some basic cyber hygiene. And at the end of the day, the framework that CMMC is stipulating is mostly basic cyber hygiene, some elevated and enhanced controls and best practices, but the investment in increasing your cybersecurity is dramatically reducing that risk of exposure to a breach, heaven forbid. But these days, it's not about is it going to happen? It's about when is it going to happen, and how many controls do you have in place to actually reduce the impact so you can survive the breach. That's a huge alignment, and we are starting to see a shift in perception that it's about speaking the language of the business. It's reducing risk. It's not just, oh, we have to do this. No, this is the right thing to do anyway.
You made a good point, Jeff, about this being able to be used as a value add to your customers too. And I think you already touched on the point that you will get these requirements flowing down through contracts, and then you will in turn be required to audit your supply chain and hold them accountable for this as well. And the more difficult you make this process for your customers when they're managing this, the more challenging this whole process is going to be. So if you can make that as simple as possible and really understand your obligations here, and when you have to work with the compliance officers for your customers, and be able to just hand them a book and say, yes, we meet all these, and we can demonstrate this very, very simply. I mean, you can promote that as a value add. I mean, that's a big deal, because it does cost your customers money to manage these requirements flowing down. It'll cost you money as well. And I think you're going to start to see that as part of selection process, within the awards, contracts and awards processes.
All right, let's go on to our next question. How does an organization get started working towards their CMMC? Jeff?
Yeah, good one. I think we've covered pretty well the why, right? Why do you have to be compliant? And we spent a lot of time focusing on what's driving it. Is it because you have to? Is it a contractual obligation, a business differentiator, or a vertical? So if we're past that, we're now into okay, now what do you actually have to do? There's a pretty long list, but we can simplify it, right? Step one is understand the framework and the actual impact to your organization. So know what you have to do. And that's the place to start, is in the details of that regulatory framework. It's NIST 800-171. It's about understanding what are you doing now versus what are you not doing that you must be doing. You need to establish policies, standards, procedures, and controls to appropriately document the entire collection of technical controls that need to be implemented as part of that regulatory framework. And we try not to underestimate that. A lot of companies who are trying to climb the maturity curve may actually be doing most of the right things, but most of the time they're typically not documented with the level of detail that will be required by the framework. So documentation is always a pretty significant focus. You need to establish, if you already don't have a governance function, you need to establish a basic governance, risk, and compliance function. A lot of that is process and procedure driven, but part of the framework requirements mandate that you actually have that GRC function in your business, even if it's relatively ad hoc, to regularly discuss and assess your risk, make sure you're capturing items on the risk register, do the occasional vulnerability assessments, engage the appropriate third-party provider to actually run that security function for you. That's a big part of getting started. Most of the time, we advise starting with a gap assessment to actually determine the scope of potential remediation, right? So you understand the framework, you need to look at your policies and your document set to see what it needs improving. And then you really do need a gap assessment that is a pretty detailed walkthrough of the requirements, what they mean to you as a business, and how well you are or are not already meeting the requirements. Collecting these supporting artifacts to be able to demonstrate that compliance. At the end of the day, you need to understand what your gap is and what your plan of actions and milestones look like to close that gap, to be in a position to meet the regulatory requirement. And to be clear, CMMC readiness and CMMC prep doesn't actually mean you have to be perfect, right? You don't need 100% score to qualify for these contracts. Even as a contract gate, but what you need to be able to demonstrate is that you understand your position, your documentation is up to par to demonstrate that you're actually doing the things that you're supposed to be doing. And it's okay to have a gap. It's okay to have identified we're 72% of the way there, as long as you've got an action plan that spells out, hey, and in the next 6 to 18 months, here's how we're going to close all those gaps. There are certainly some requirements driven by the process around what can be on that plan of actions and milestones and what can't, what you're going to have to fix immediately and what you'll get 2 or 3 years to fix. But the important part is understanding what is your starting point, where are you now, and then managing that remediation path forward. It sounds complicated. It's actually a pretty basic set of steps. It's about understanding what you're doing and taking a look, a good hard look at what those gaps are. And it's fine if you don't know how to fix them, because there's all kinds of folks who can certainly help you understand some best practices and solutions to put in place. The last point I will make before I hand this one off is we most frequently advise, do what you do well as a business. Don't focus on building a bigger IT function just because you've got these potentially new requirements. It's typically a more effective approach to third party some of this stuff, right? Let people who are experts in the field deal with your security problems, and you'll be better suited to run your business than have to build a new IT function simply to meet a requirement.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Anyone else want to add anything to that? Are we good?
No, that's good. Excellent.
Okay, here we go. All right. So what is a cybersecurity framework, CSF? Dilip, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I will use my next 4 hours to go through this. So
Right.
yeah, this will definitely be a conversation for the entire group. So what maybe I'll focus on is maybe the CMMC stuff that kind of, crosswalks. So, CSF, cybersecurity framework, NIST based, NIST for the US, ISO for Europe is what we used to say at one point. Other countries are adopting NIST, other countries are adopting ISO 27001. CSF is a basic framework. 1.1 is current. In draft is actually 2.0. 2.0 is actually pretty close to being final, and there's some differences in there. Further to like a CMMC conversation, there's a focus on governance, right? There's a much more focus this time going forward on governance. And as we talked before, risk management strategy is another thing in CSF 2.0 that's going down this process. It's a framework that you can crosswalk all your other compliances and things that you need to do, whether it's CMMC, whether it's PCI, whether it's whatever state functions that you're doing. Most states reference CSF now to some extent. CMMC, Jeff or Derek can talk a little bit more about what that means within the tiers. But I think from a new standpoint, governance is a big one. Risk management strategy. It's a great starting point. From where you are. It's vague enough that you can get started and mature against it. The one problem maybe is that it's vague and it's hard to mature against. It's not really clear and precise. CMMC is a little more precise in that sense. So I'll open up to everybody, get this conversation going, because I don't want to hog all the CSF on this one as well. So I'll open it up.
No, that's a good point on it being vague, and Jeff made a couple good points on about making sure your documentation and your process are up to par. It's a guide, right? It's a guide on how do you do better at protecting your organization, protecting your information, protecting your ability to do business. So, if you're, even though it is vague, if you're looking at it and thinking about the intent of how do I answer those questions, how do I protect myself a little bit better? If you're just doing the minimum to check a box, then you're not really doing yourself a service to begin with. So, I mean, that's something to definitely keep in mind, that these are some best practices, and a lot of them are not over the top. But you do need to make sure you're keeping the whole business in mind and not just from an IT perspective. Right? Change control, for example, you have to have some sort of ability to do change control. Right, being able to monitor that you can someone made a change on your firewall is a big deal. Auditing and proving that through history, a change process to say, all right, keep it simple. It doesn't have to be complex, but we have a process. Here's what it looks like. I can prove a change was made. I can prove it was approved. And oh, by the way, I can go back and show the last 30 or 50 changes we made over a window of time, a period of time. Right. So there are technical aspects of that, but you also think about change control from a physical perspective, right? You change locks on doors in a building. You change, video camera systems. You change badge reader systems, right? All of that needs to be part of the conversation. It's not just a technical function. And oftentimes those types of things are not ever tied to IT. So that's a good, opportunity to get the entire organization involved when you're talking about these things and get it outside of IT, even though there's a technical element. One of the things we typically say is from a monitoring and a technical security perspective, like 30 to 40% of the controls are either satisfied or are pretty closely satisfied. From a technical perspective, like you can put tools and technology and services in place to cover only about a third, right? The rest of it is process, it's policy, it's procedure. There's a lot of other aspects to that, but it's as I mentioned, it's a guide. It is vague, but if you keep kind of the core principles and the intent in mind, you can oftentimes answer your own question about what it's asking you to do, even if you're not 100% sure exactly what it applies to. You can get pretty close in most cases.
Yeah, I'll just jump in with from a CSF perspective. I mean, if we talk about the NIST cybersecurity framework specifically, we're a big fan, right? The DoD and the federal government set of controls that stipulate NIST 800-171, or heaven forbid, actual federal agency with NIST 853. Those are both very proscriptive frameworks that say, you have to do this thing, and here is specifically how we expect you to do it. The NIST CSF is a great analog for commercial organizations or non-defense organizations, because it, in effect, captures and reinforces all of the same important concepts, but without the same level of prescriptive specificity about how you must implement these controls. And change control is a great example, right? Backup and recovery is a great example. Incident response is a great example. Implementing the CSF is, we believe, absolutely the right move for organizations who do not have a mandated framework. If you are going, I need to do these things, I need to have a stick against which to measure how well I'm doing cybersecurity, we view that as the gold standard. If you don't have a more stringent, proscribed framework that you must adhere to, CSF is absolutely the starter that we advise for all of the commercial orgs that we work with.
Yeah, I think even in cyber insurance, one of the questions you see now is, excuse me, what framework are you using? Right, it's a question now that you're seeing in cyber insurance, and CSF is a great answer, because it's never checked the box kind of completeness. It's a journey that you're going through, and maturity against that journey is what you're trying to achieve. CSF is something that I think you're going to see even more adoption. Even like I said, even at the state level, you're seeing a lot of people referencing what security framework are you. FTC almost pretty much said CSF, but they didn't say the word CSF, but they said, what framework are you using? How do you govern against your maturity? How do you do these things? So it's a great place to start. Great point on, it's not just IT, it's security awareness and training for the entire business, not just how well are you protecting things.
Right.
But it's as useful as much to have technology and things that map to those as well, that you actually can mature it to a technology standpoint as well.
I think those are probably all the same reasons that you're starting to see a lot of other industries adopt the exact same requirements flowing down. I mean, and put it into law, right? You're seeing it in K through 12 in New York State and other states pretty close to adopting it as a requirement to protect data for children, for students, right? And staff as well. And you're starting to see it in discussions about this applying to healthcare, right? HIPAA's been around for a long time, but it doesn't have the prescriptive guidance like this necessarily. And people are starting to see the need for starting to apply things like this in more detail to other industries. And by the way, there's probably going to be some discussion about, just because you may not apply, CMMC may not apply to you today, at some point that may branch out and be more broadly applied to any organization that could be doing business with the government or the supply chain, not just products, but it could be services and other things related to that. And it's all for the same reason that it's a best practice, it's a set of best practice principles, right? It's just about how do you do the right thing to protect your organization to begin with. And in a lot of cases, it needs to be put into legislation to have some teeth, but that's what I think what we're starting to see. But definitely, I think something to really keep in mind is that it's just a good way to build a security program.
Yeah, it's interesting, Derek. If you read the, Dilip talked a little bit about the CSF version 2.0 coming out shortly. Well, similarly, the NIST 800-171 is going from V2 to V3 shortly. And if you read the changes, it seems pretty clear that the intent is that this framework will likely cascade across all of government, not just the DoD. So the expectation is we're only a few short years away from anyone doing business with the federal government, period, not just the Defense Department, is likely to be subject to the same set of controls. And what that means is you can look at any supply chain, and at some point that supply chain goes up into a federal government agency. So, the concept of what do you do as a starter? This is absolutely where to start, because those frameworks this isn't going away. The problem's not going away. The lack of compliance resulting in the increased data breaches today is not going away. So this is only going to become stricter.
Super helpful. We've got one more question until we get to our questions and answers. So let's go with this. Can you do this alone, or what type of partners can help? I'm going to say Derek.
Sure. Yeah. So it's a good question. As we've talked about here, right, there's a kind of a few different key areas to looking at building a whole program, right? One is, assessing where you start, where you are now, right? Doing some sort of gap assessment against what are your current practices, policies, procedures, technology, how are they implemented against the framework, and coming up with a list of gaps, right? Or putting that into a poem or plan of action and milestones, right? Which is a list of those gaps with some sort of timeline of when you're going to close them, who they're assigned to, and maybe some weighting of how difficult or costly those might be to implement. So you can start to prioritize the importance and time and long lead time items for those types of things, right? So you can certainly do those internally. As Jeff mentioned, there's a lot of folks like us that have been doing this in practice for a long time, that have done many gap assessments, and are likely to be able to move much faster to get to that point of having a gap completed. And then once you have the gap, right, it depends what the gaps really are on where you want to go from there, right? If you have a tremendous number of policies and procedures that need to be not only written but implemented, right? There's a lot of cultural discussions within an organization to be able to write those and actually get those implemented. Having a policy written is not acceptable, right? It has to be implemented. You have to be able to prove it. You have to be able to test against it. And getting that from inception all the way through, depending on what the policy is, can be challenging. And again, we're not talking just about IT. We're talking about physical security. We're talking about document handling. We're talking about processes for how you interface with your customers, right? So having folks that really understand the process up and down the supply chain are really going to be instrumental in being able to help have those discussions about how you change culture and process within the organization. And then you have, as I mentioned, about a third of the pieces here are very technical, right? You have to have log monitoring and SIM in place. That by itself, they don't necessarily call out SIM yet. There's been a lot of discussion about it, but you have to be able to prove a lot of things that are almost impossible to do without having a SIM in place. You have to have a long period of audit trails. You have to be able to run reports over a period of time. You have to be able to prove that you're identifying security alarms and issues as they come up and applying your incident response procedure and practices to them, right? So there's a lot of third-party organizations, Sidara included, that run a 24/7 SOC that can drop right in, and you're already covering about a third of the requirements there without having to add a whole lot of extra hardware or high cost new technology through procurement. Or people, right, or new hires to have to do any of that stuff. So there are, definitely a lot of service providers and organizations, like a present company included, that can drop in and really help speed up this process, make it much simpler, and over the long run, probably make it much more cost effective as well.
I would answer that one, I think, similarly, but I would probably be a bit more cynical. Sure you could do this yourself. Why would you want to? We actually bring it back down to, this is a business and a risk decision. Is your core business cybersecurity, IT strategy, and gap assessments? Then by all means, do this yourself. Are you a multinational enterprise with your own security operations center and a compliance team of 37 people? Go ahead, do it yourself. For most businesses, the answer is, why would you do this yourself? Because again, not to be difficult, but you probably don't know enough about it to do it effectively. Concentrate on your core business and let the experts deal with these problems. And what I mean by that is I think the world has moved on to a point where most companies realize that in today's challenging threat environment, you are going to be less capable with your internal staff than outsourcing a certain level of managed cybersecurity to somebody who's an expert at it. You're probably not, as a company, going to staff 24/7 around the clock support to have eyes on traffic to make sure your network's not getting infiltrated. Well, that's basically a requirement of these frameworks if you understand how to effectively implement them. So I think step one is you absolutely, again, unless you're a prime and you've got your own massive cybersecurity team, the business case to do this internally simply does not add up, period, the end. So that one's a no-brainer. If you don't have an MSSP, you need to get one yesterday. I think the other part of it is from an assessment and an understanding where you are perspective. You can absolutely do this yourself if you want to go to work and learn what the regs mean. Anybody can learn what the regs mean. I think the advantage you get by engaging someone who does this professionally is it's one thing to understand what the reg says and translate it into what you have to do. It's another thing entirely to have the experience of being through countless audits with the Defense Department and with prime contractors and with the defense industrial base to understand the delta between what the reg says and how you need to effectively implement it to pass a certification or an assessment. Those are very different things. So there is a fair bit of interpretation that's involved in figuring out how to implement some of these regs. And the other bit is a present company included. There are all kinds of companies that can help you figure out how to implement a program like this without breaking the bank, right? There's what do you have to do? And then there's how can you do this effectively within your probably limited budget of resource, time, and FTEs. So I think that engaging the right partner can allow you to reach your goals more effectively, but actually achieve compliance in a way that does not break the business. And those are all, I think, critically important considerations. So, I mean, our perspective is to this question, yeah, it depends. You could do this yourself. It's probably not the best business decision to take that approach.
Yeah, Jeff, it's similar answer for me as well. And why would you do this to yourself? So typically talk to customers about this, and they I say, don't you already have a day job? I think you're pretty responsible for a lot of things here, and you're going to add an entire compliance and governance and monitoring and all those things on top of that. You can do some of these things internally. You have to do some of these things internally, FSO, and there's a couple other things, and it goes all the way down to your shipping and receiving of physical labels of a CUI and stuff like that. So there are things you have to do internally. You don't need to outsource those type of things, but to try to do those things by yourself with this kind of workload and this kind of responsibility and risk and adding risk to the component is probably not advisable. And again, it's a business decision, like you said, Jeff, before. This is a business decision. This isn't a IT decision. This isn't just a auditing decision or something like that. The other pieces that are just outside of what you should be doing is auditing and testing, right? You really shouldn't be auditing your own work, or try not to, at least from that standpoint. So, there are some components at 53 and that level that you're required to do third party, but it's a best practice in general. Don't do your own pen test. Don't do your own auditing. Don't do something like that. Have third party. If you think you're mature, then that's a perfect example of showing of where you are. It actually puts you in your proper business cycle of where you're mature or you're not mature, and having third-party validation is another reason why you would want to do that. There's no statements that say CMMC must be third-party at most of the levels. Up until 53 does have a little bit of that. But why would you do this by yourself?
Yeah, that is an interesting point on the third-party bit. So currently the requirement, the way that it reads and the way we're expecting the rule to come out is Level 1, where there'll be no mandated third-party assessment. Level 2 is, yes, there will, but it depends on where you fall in level 2. And then level 3 is absolutely third-party assessment. But interestingly enough, the 800-171 V2 to V3, V3 mandates third-party gap assessment. It doesn't go into the details yet about what does that mean. Is it a C3PAO accredited third party? Can you simply hire a professional services organization? But it sounds like third-party gap assessments are going to become mandated as part of 800-171. There's a whole lot of TBD. But to your point, Dilip, you know, it's fine to take a swipe at understanding your gap, but you don't want to do a gap assessment yourself to plan to hand off to the DoD.
Yeah, and if you're a CIO or if you're a non-technical person who owns this, maybe the ops, you know, a COO or something like that, if you do it internally, you're tying your program to people that may leave you as well.
Right.
So, you know, that is another component that you see a lot where somebody gets into this implementation, realizes it's a, you know, it's going to add 30 more hours a month to their workload, and they quit and they leave. And now you're tied to that, where at least third party you can hold them accountable and mandate and those kinds like that. So that's another reason why do you take this on? You know, many corporations, even if they have the internal people, they still prefer to have this as guidance and movements. You know, whether it's, you know, Jeff, from a CISO level, where, you know, you can go in there with your experience multiple times. You've done this not just for one company one time. You've done this through multiple companies, and there may even be an instance where you've done it for a company exactly like them, you know. So having that experience, third-party experience, is something that is invaluable and cannot be replicated by somebody who's been in your company for 10 or 15 years doing one job and one job only.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, we are at questions and answers, and I know that we have one question in the window. So I'm going to read it. We only have a couple minutes left. So our last MSSP didn't manage our certification requirements well. What should I look for in an MSSP to make sure that that is handled? Derek?
Yeah, maybe I'll take that one. I'll keep this quick. I know we're short on time. So, you know, I think, as I mentioned before, there's about a third of the controls that have a very technical element. And an MSSP or MDR service provider, right, a security service provider, someone that's going to bring the tools, technology, a 24/7 SOC, and implement this and run cybersecurity monitoring for you, much like what Sidara does here and really specializes in. It is going to focus on what technology do you have first, right? Go through asset inventory and then work up a plan to collect logs and operational data to be able to monitor all of these things. Now, one of the things we put a big focus on, and I know not necessarily all MSSPs are aligned with compliance controls, but that's something that we really put a huge focus on, because we've been doing this sort of thing for a very, very long time, pre CMMC. So a lot of the implementation we're thinking about from the beginning and being proactive rather than reactive. So that's one of the big things I would ask as you're going through this process is, you know, what sort of things are automatically understood going into an MSSP, because an MSSP is not intended to be your compliance gate or manager, right? Typically you want someone that's going to actually build the program, define the program, and then an MSSP is going to help fill the gaps. A lot of organizations are kind of in the opposite cycle of that, where they say, well, I know I need somebody, I need help monitoring, I need 24/7 coverage. I know I need this. I don't know all the reasons why. So you have an MSSP, but never thought to ask them, you know, do they know how to do CMMC compliance or NIST CSF based compliance? So when you go to ask for reports and when you're going through that audit cycle, there's often kind of this miscommunication situation where, yeah, I can run a report, but you have to tell me exactly what you want, or otherwise I don't really know what you're looking for or why you need it, right? So, you know, looking for someone that really understands this already, when you say, all right, well, I need, you know, a report that helps satisfy, you know, control, you know, 1.3, 1.8, whatever it is, that they know exactly what the intent is. And also kind of dealing with auditors, right? Do you want a report or do you want auditable screenshot? That's what an auditor needs to see, right? So I think understanding that process and having someone that really, you know, ask the question of how many audits have you helped go through as an MSSP is really a big question, because I think that that can really pay dividends of having someone really make your life easier as you're going through building the program and then getting certified and audited against it down the road.
Terrific. Thank you. And then we are at the top of the hour. So I would like to thank everybody for your attendance. Thank you so much, our panel of distinguished speakers today. You guys are wonderful. Definitely shared a lot of information, a lot of takeaways. So if anyone has any questions that are attending, feel free to email me, liz.syke@cybersecurity.com, and I'll make sure it's routed to the appropriate resource that we have to help support you. So in that, have a wonderful afternoon and a terrific day. Take care.
Thanks, folks. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.